Yeah, and I think that generally speaking,
Excuse me.
it's easy to be negative, but generally speaking, we're pretty positive. I was thinking about this the other day. It's easy on Twitter and Facebook to be very negative and attack and go on the attack mode. But if you've listened to our episodes, we do try to construct something. We do try to apply principles in a positive way. Positive meaning trying to affirm good things and not just critique, not just have a kind of sort of negativity the whole time. So
yeah, that's huge.
Would Albert Mohler fall anywhere within your line of thinking?
I'll let Thomas answer that one.
My name is Joel Sedekase. In 2009, I left my job in the business world to teach Bible at a Christian high school in Chicago. Impacted by my students' questions, I set out on a journey that brought me first to seminary to study apologetics and philosophy of religion, and then into pastoral ministry. As a pastor, I saw firsthand the struggle of believers confronted with questions of life that at first seemed impossible to answer, and the powerful confidence that came when they saw how God's Word gives the answers and guidance they needed. I had a dream to spread that message and equip more followers of Jesus, so my family and I joined Crew and launched the Think Institute. Now, I'm on a mission to equip believers to explain, share, and defend the Christian message by applying timeless biblical truths to current cultural challenges. I don't have all the answers, but I'm determined to find them. And through this show, I'm reporting back to you, the Think Squad, what I discover. Welcome to the Think Podcast. Really quickly before we start, learning how to interpret all of life through the lens of God's Word takes a lot of work, more than just 1 or 2 podcast episodes a week. If you have an interest in the intersection between the biblical worldview and biblical manhood and current events, as I do, as well as philosophy, theology, and many, many leather-bound books, consider joining our free online community, the Think Squad group on Facebook, Gab, and on Signal. There you can join hundreds of other Christ followers who are also on the same journey, and we trade apologetics stories and strategies. We discuss philosophy and theological questions. It's like a huge bull session around a bonfire in your backyard or at your favorite cigar lounge. So check out the Think Squad group on Facebook, Gab, and Signal. All right, well, this is the Think Institute podcast, and I'm Joel Sedekase. Really quickly want to introduce myself. If you're new to the show, maybe you were listening to the 12 days of Christmas that we did here on the Think Pod, and you're like, I wonder what this show is all about. I wonder if they have any more interesting and engaging episodes. Well, the good news is you definitely tuned in on the right day, because we have got what the Brits might call a barnstormer today. But before we get into it and I introduce our guests and allow them to introduce themselves, let me just introduce myself in case you don't know who I am. So I am the founder and lead teacher of the Think Institute. And what we do is we resource families to think and engage biblically. And the goal of this podcast is to help dads lead their families in explaining, sharing, and defending the Christian message. So we get into a lot of different subjects. We're all about answering those impossible questions, confronting and answering current cultural challenges with timeless biblical truth. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. If you don't know my story, I'm happily married to Elisa. I'm the father of 4, and we live somewhere in the Chicagoland, Fox Valley region of Illinois. I've done some writing and some podcasting and some content creation, things like that. But you're not here to listen to me. You're here to find out how to engage politically. So that's enough of me. Now let's pass it over to my co-host, Prof. Khaldun Schweiss. How you doing, Prof?
Doing great. Say better than I deserve, right? Say that.
Amen. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I have been associate professor of philosophy at the City Colleges of Chicago for over a decade now. I absolutely love what I do. I'm shocked I get paid for it. And I'm also in my other life a Christian life coach. my goal is to equip men specifically to be more productive, passionate, purposeful, and peaceful in their lives and the lives of those that they interact with. I like to say that I don't do jokes like the Germans. I saw this German commercial once. And there was this guy telling jokes and nobody was laughing at the bar. And the guy looks at the other guy, says, "We are Germans. We do beer, not jokes." Awesome. I just say I do ideas and very little, much else. So.
All right. Now let's introduce our guests. Stephen Wolfe and Thomas Achord are our guests today. Stephen, why don't you start by telling us about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I guess in terms of denominational background, I'm Presbyterian. I've been Presbyterian for a few years at least, and I'll spare you my theological journey, but it went from atheist to Presbyterian, so I'm happily at Presbyterian.
Wow.
I currently live in New Jersey. I did graduate school in political theory and philosophy at LSU. That's where I met Thomas, and now I'm at I have a postdoctoral fellowship at the James Madison program that's at Princeton University. So I'm doing that now, and I work on broadly, I'd say, Protestant political theory, but my historical emphasis is on early American political thought from the Puritans to the American founding. So that's some of the work I'm doing now while I'm at Princeton.
Awesome. Well, I'm definitely jealous that you get to be at Princeton. If for nothing else, then they have maybe the most beautiful campus. I just love the architecture there at Princeton.
Yeah, it's wonderful to walk through there. It's a little, I guess my pessimistic, negative nature gets a little upset with the kind of the state of Princeton, given its origins. Because I wrote a thesis on John Witherspoon, who was a president there around the founding era. But it is beautiful. So, but it's great to imagine Madison and Witherspoon walking around and them studying and lecturing.
Fantastic. All right, Thomas Achord, could you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, guys. My name is Thomas Achord. I live in Louisiana, and I'm the headmaster of a classical school down here called Sequitur. I've been involved in classical education for a while. I also teach online. I actually studied theology. I went to LSU for history, then I went to Southern for theology, and do a podcast with Stephen. I've was mentioning earlier before we started recording that I've published a few anthologies, I would call them. One of them is a reader, one's an anthology. Both of them center on political thought, political writings. And it's a little bit about me. I'm happily married. I have four daughters. So they keep me occupied pretty much full time. And it's really great. So happy to be on. Thanks, guys.
That's fantastic. And we also found out backstage we have another connection. Well, you told me Tom Brewer is your father-in-law.
That's right.
And Tom Brewer and I hit the streets down in New Orleans last year at Declaring Truth at Mardi Gras. And just the man is an absolute dynamo, loves the Lord. And I don't know, what do you think? Is dynamo the right word to describe Tom?
Yeah, he actually, outside of street preaching, he's very calm. And you wouldn't, he's mild-mannered, he's soft-spoken, but he does a lot of street preaching or witnessing. For instance, he goes down all the time to the abortion mill in Baton Rouge, and he is definitely, he finds his voice in those moments, definitely.
Very cool. Well, I met him through Zoe White, who runs Declaring Truth at Mardi Gras, and it was a wonderful experience. So very cool to find out we have that connection.
Yeah.
So you guys host the Ars Politica podcast. And I got to tell you, I'd never heard of Ars Politica until I decided I was going to do a little bit of market research. So as you can see, I host a podcast, and I'm always interested in like, what are the people who are my potential listeners and my actual listeners, what else are they listening to? So I'm in a number of different Facebook groups, and I put out a question in all these different Facebook groups that I'm a part of, that, groups that I thought would reflect sort of my target audience. And I said, what other podcasts do you guys listen to? What do you listen to? And Ars Politica kept on coming up. It was one of the top mentioned podcasts. And I'm like, what is Ars Politica? And so looked you guys up and started listening, started following, sent you friend requests on Facebook and whatnot, and seeing how your Facebook feeds are filled with old classical architecture and and like these throwbacks to bygone days. And I'm like, I really like the cut of these guys' jib here. And let's see what they're all about. So I started listening to your show. And my only complaint about your show is I wish there were more episodes to listen to. It's great. It's excellent.
Thanks.
Yeah. So why start Ars Politica? Why get involved in politics? Like, what a headache to have to follow all these political trends. Why wade into that world?
Man, I think for me, I recall something that C.S. Lewis said. I'm going to have to paraphrase him, but the reason that I got into it is because there's just so much bad politics out there, especially, my opinion, in the evangelical world. When we hear people talking politics, it's often it's really, I don't want to say misinformed. That's not the right word. It's confusing. It's not even clear what it is people are saying. And yeah, normally I would rather be someone like George Washington, like minding my business out on my house in the country or something. But there's just a lot of bad out there. And so for no other reason, we need to get out and correct things, at least from my perspective. Another reason I got into it, was to, I started teaching it at school, and I studied it some in college as well. And so those are my prior interests. But the reason for the podcast is that.
That makes sense.
For me.
Sorry to cut you off there, but part of the joy of doing these remotely instead of all in person, talking over each other like that. But even George Washington, his ideal life, of course, was on his farm, and yet when duty called, he did the Cincinnatus thing, and you guys will appreciate that old classical reference, I'm sure. And he entered the fray, defeated the British, and then he went back and returned to his farm. So, maybe Thomas, after all this cultural and political insanity is over with, and we've defeated the left, hey, then you can return back to your farm.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I don't want to make myself out to be George Washington. I don't mean that. I don't have delusions of grandeur, but that's just the first.
Neither did he.
For me. Yeah.
So, Stephen, anything you want to add to that? Why Ars Politica? Why this partnership between the two of you? You met down there at
LSU. We lived close to one another, and it was one day I had dinner at his house, and my wife and I think my kids and everyone, we all went out there, but he and I started talking, and I don't remember if it was me or him, but we all just we both kind of said, we should just turn this, like, people might like to listen to this, and if they don't, who cares? So we literally said that, well, we might get a few people listening to us, who knows, but at least it'll give us the chance to state things that we believe are important, in kind of a unique way. I think within our circle of Reformed Protestants, there is, I think people needed some kind of voice that's on the right, that is Protestant, and that's not your typical conservative, I guess you could say center right or mainstream conservative talking points. And so we've been trying to fill that gap as best we could, and we've had pretty decent success. We don't do a lot of marketing. We just record an episode, maybe once a week or every 2 weeks, and people have been really receptive. So it's been great.
Who's an example of somebody who's not what you're trying to do, like the center right Christian conservative? who's the anti Ars Politica out there? Come on, name names.
Basically, you want us to name names. It's
yes,
yeah.
I mean, we name names all the time. I mean, the most obvious would be someone like David French or Russell Moore, and Ed Stetzer. I mean, these are all kind of typical evangelical guys. There's other more academic guys who I'm not hostile to, but probably wouldn't agree with us, like Mark Tooley, I think is his name. I'm not hostile to him at all, by the way, but I think that along the typical, I guess you could say, to use a derogatory term, like boomer conservatism is probably the more militant side of that, is probably more hostile to what sort of things we say. I'd say that yeah, like Thomas and I are more paleocon. If you want to put us into a tradition, we're probably closest to a paleoconservative.
Yeah, I think to me, I can name some names, I suppose, but for me, one of the things I see happening, at least in the Reformed evangelical world especially, is that you have people who claim to stand in line with a bunch of past Protestants, a past Reformed tradition, and yet they're clearly moving in I would not even say leftward direction, but just they're flowing with whatever the culture's saying right now, and it happens to be a very leftward direction politically, and yet claiming to be Christian, Protestant, Reformed. I'm in the OPC, or I'm in the PCA, or whatever it is, and I'm Reformed. John Calvin is my predecessor, and I hold to this politically. And in my mind, I'm thinking, you either haven't read Calvin or you're rejecting Calvin. and it's not just Calvin. I'm just using that as an example. But part of what I see us doing is trying to not call that out so much as to bring to people who call themselves Reformed Protestants, to bring to them their rich political heritage, and put that in front of them, but also do it in a way that's relevant to things that are going on today generally.
Yeah, and I think that generally speaking, it's easy to be negative, but generally speaking, we're pretty positive. I was thinking about this the other day. It's easy on Twitter and Facebook to be very negative and attack and go on the attack mode. But if you've listened to our episodes, we do try to construct something. We do try to apply principles in a positive way. Positive meaning trying to affirm good things and not just critique, not just have a kind of sort of negativity the whole time. So
yeah, that's huge.
Would Albert Mohler fall anywhere within your line of thinking?
I'll let Thomas answer that one.
This is known as passing the buck. Thank you. Yeah,
he's the president. He's the president. For those of you who don't know, he's the president of the seminary that I attended. So I met him and his wife, Mary Mohler, and I knew one of their children. So I like Al Mohler personally. I think that I'll just say this. I'll put it the best way I could put it is, I don't follow his daily briefing. I gave it up a few years ago because I found that all that he would do in his approach would be to show the contradictions between the world and Christians, but he would provide nothing. He wouldn't provide much else forward. And so he would provide a lot of culture or it's like, I don't want to negatively critique him too much here, but it seemed to me to be a shortened cultural critique that was wanting, and he wouldn't go much further. Now, I don't follow the campus politics very much of what's happening at Southern about whether he hired a woke prof or all this stuff. I've left that, so I don't follow that much. Yeah.
Okay. That's fair. Very diplomatic answer. You may have a future in politics, actually. That was
That's a good question. That reminds me of climate change. Thank you. Yeah. Very good.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just listening to the briefing this morning, and I've got it in my podcast feed. I used to listen religiously every single day to Al Mohler. Yeah. So for those listening who don't know, Al Mohler has a podcast called The Briefing, in which it used to be about 20 minutes. Now it's about 30 minutes of cultural commentary. And, Thomas, what you said, I think is very true. He's very insightful at diagnosing a problem,
Right.
but he oftentimes leaves it there. And I don't know him personally, so I can say this. I am often left wanting. I feel as though, I get done with the episode and I'm agitated and I'm worked up and I'm like, man, this is ridiculous. I can't believe they're trying to, bring BLM transvestite storybook readers into my local public library.
Yeah.
But what do I do about it? What do I do about it?
Right.
And so it sounds like you guys, your philosophy towards political engagement is you're trying to take it that next. Not only are you, it seems like you're trying to come in on the right of Al Mohler, and not only to the right, but a few centuries back. We can explain what paleoconservatism is, but you're also trying to sort of complete the loop and bring it around to a solution. You're trying to build something constructive. Am I on the right track here?
I would say yes. We're not trying to just single-handedly build something. I would say there's a broader perspective here, which is Al Mohler. It's not just him. There's a conservatism, or what Stephen said is boomer conservatism. It's a passive posture. If you're conserving something, you're holding on you're holding on to a life raft or something, you're holding on to the pieces of something that's falling apart. You're not necessarily building something. And so I think if you actively want to be building something, you either have to be on the left of politics today, because that's the people who are building things, culture, or whatever it is, institutions, or you have to go somewhere else, and that's a little further to the right, at least politically. And we can talk about what all that means, but yeah, so it's not necessarily like a strategy. It's just, if you want to do something more than preserve, you have to promote that positive vision. And a lot of conservatives don't. They don't promote a positive vision of anything as a social good, for instance. And that's not enough. I think 2022 now, we realize that merely holding on to the last remnants of things is a losing strategy for all areas of life. Our families, we've lost bathrooms now, schools a long time ago. It's just so many things we could point out.
Yeah, and I think to follow that, I think one of the things that we want to emphasize is one, I think, firstly, a kind of a critique of a sort of neutrality. And I don't mean that in a theological or, but I mean in the sense like this sense that like from almost like a classical, you can say classical liberal perspective, where we need to have maximum toleration of difference. And so that means our institutions that like our schools, our public schools, and just our culture itself has to be something that is widely or maximally tolerant. And I'd say that's a sort of neutrality. But what that ends up doing is it ends up you end up no longer loving the place that you live. And if you do, it ends up being fundamentally changed and eradicated. And I think conservatives nowadays, the ones that are kind of starting to see what's happening with the left takeover, is they're seeing that these institutions and just the assumptions about culture, about a way of life, decency, what's good and what's bad, have been so kind of turned on their head that they're beginning to realize that institutions in our kind of public space and culture has been taken over. And that's in part been because we've allowed that to happen, because I think in some ways we've shown goodwill. So if you have your typical conservative academic nowadays will say, yeah, we need viewpoint diversity. And so you'll have these public institutions, or private too. And you'll hire people who are liberal or left. You'll say, well, we want a diversity of views, and we shouldn't exclude people based on their views. And we seem to believe the left in the 60s and 70s when they were crying about free speech.
Yeah.
But when they took over these institutions, they actively want to exclude people who are to the right of liberal. I mean, I was just reading about how Tim Keller, of all people, was I think it was 2017. He was denied an award from Princeton Seminary of all places. I mean, it's not surprising. But you go back 150, 120 years ago, and that seminary, well, I guess it'd be more like 150. That was the center of Reformed theology in the United States. So you see how things, once you allow once you affirm this neutrality, this idea of neutrality, this idea of goodwill towards viewpoint diversity, and that we should what's the line? I don't agree with you, but I'll defend to death that you can affirm it. Yeah. I mean, that's just crazy. I'm just saying, that's crazy. I mean,
so you don't agree with that? You think that's bad? That's bad policy?
Well, I mean, there should be some diversity in viewpoint. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be that, because then you wouldn't dialogue at all. But there's some things where you just say no, that's not allowed, and that's it. But that's just viewpoint too. That's on the plane of kind of intellectual thought. I think that I think Thomas could probably speak to this in more terms of experience, because he's born and raised in the South and lived there his whole life, and I haven't really lived any place in whole life besides California, which has been taken over entirely. If you have a people in a place and they're in a certain, there's a locations, a place, and there's a characteristic to that. There's a way of life. There's a mutual understanding that kind of goes beyond words. That's like mutually understood. You understand people by their gestures, by the way they talk. You understand what's expected when you go to their house. All sorts of things that we just take for granted based upon these cultural norms. And that's something worth protecting. But I think we have a tendency in something. I'm sorry, I'm talking so long. But the thing that the Thomas I like to emphasize is that this is a good thing, and it needs to be protected. And so we're trying to work out, well, how do you protect that, and what ways and what means can you protect that? Because this particularity is something that's good for us, and we can't just view our culture as something that just can be, fundamentally multicultural. So, yeah.
If I may, gentlemen, I know we were going to talk about the myopsychosis, and it talks about the cultural ethos of the time. And back in the days of the 90s and 80s, when Alan Brew in the University of Chicago wrote The Closing of the American Mind, and he started the book off talking about the problem of relativism, where every major college and university in the world, is every student coming in is embracing some kind of relativistic notion of ethics, and that has shifted. Those students are now politicians and teachers and academics, and they're pushing policy toward this inclusive policy, this tolerance toward everything. And the Atlantic Monthly astutely put forward an article about 4 years ago called "The Death of Relativism," arguing that Alan Bloom's thought process was maybe true at the time, but the cultural ethos has shifted. It's no longer relativistic. It is absolutist or objectivist, but it's objectivist toward a particular type of values: tolerance, love, grace, peace, and excluding natural law, excluding ethics of absolutes in areas of sexuality, of standing up for personal integrity, of the marriage institution, specifically in the areas of ethics and religion. So that has shifted the ball in that regard. I don't think it's a relativistic type of culture that's embracing tolerance. They're not embracing tolerance. They're intolerant towards certain points of view, and many of them are proud of it, such as Twitter and others who are jumping on the cancel culture bandwagon. Can we talk about that issue of this psychosis and how that applies to that?
Yes, as you were talking, I was thinking of the term repressive tolerance. Repressive tolerance. And that's a term that, who was it that came up with this? Haber Marcuse of the Frankfurt School, I think, in The Critique of Pure Tolerance, 1965, I believe, if I can remember. Basically, the idea is we do want to tolerate. We are going to tolerate because we are open-minded, but we're open-minded towards open-mindedness, not closed-mindedness. We're going to tolerate what's tolerable, not what's intolerable. And so this idea of repressive tolerance, it's basically, in my opinion, it's just a bunch of word games to say what you were saying here a second ago. We're not actually going to be tolerant. We're going to be intolerant towards the people who deserve to be shoved out of society, and we're going to be tolerant towards people who are like us. So it's amazing to me, just to give an analogy, people will often say of this persuasion, of this mindset, will often be very open-minded, broad-minded, tolerant of new ideas, so long as those ideas look and think and walk and talk exactly like me. and are like, everybody can come to our multicultural paradise so long as they are multicultural. You know, and so it is this weird inversion and twist and play of words that you can find in books like 1984 and That Hideous Strength and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Łagutko, the Polish philosopher, that's how you say his name, right? Łagutko. He he has this line in his book, The Demon in Democracy, where he says that liberalism allows anyone to hold anything they want as long as it's liberalism.
Yeah, it's like Henry Ford. He said, you can have one of my vehicles in any color you want so long as it's black.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the multicultural, maximally tolerant society that we were promised in the 90s was a ruse. Yes, was it intentionally a ruse? Was it was this a political game that was being played, like a bait and switch? Or is it was it promulgated in good faith, and it's just when you go down a certain path, you find that there are no breaks? Do you understand what I'm saying? Is the repressive tolerance of today just a natural thing that happened as a result of walking down a particular ideological path, or was this always the end game? What do you guys think?
I mean, I would say it's hard to know because it's such a kind of varied group of people who push this, but I'll just say I generally don't trust the left at all. I think they're all out for power.
Well, how can you?
And
say
I
that?
think they're
untrustworthy and
yeah. Well, that's one of the problems with the conservatives. I think is that they have, in principle, they have this goodwill, and they extend it to people who don't deserve that goodwill, or at least that. I mean, everyone deserves a goodwill in a sense, but to be trusted and to be taken at their word, I think that's extremely foolish to do that. And I think that's proven to be correct. I mean, it's just that they're just relativists. So that was like all the worldview studies of like within evangelical fundamentalist Christian circles was relativism. But I mean, I think it just turns out that all those people use that as a way to just kind of deconstruct and critique. But once they took over, they just started to exclude. But the thing I was trying to point out earlier is that they're not. I don't think they're entirely wrong in the sense that they want to exclude what they think is damaging. I think that principle is right. So I think the tendency of conservatives is to say, well, again, you can say it, and I'll defend your right to say it, or to affirm it and speak it publicly. I think that's wrong. And we should be, I think, conservative. If conservatives want to conserve anything, they have to stand up and say, no, that's not going to be here. That's not going to happen. And we're not going to let it happen. And using the power that they have. Unfortunately, conservatives don't have any power anywhere anymore.
Yeah.
And I think, but the places where the places that conservatives do have power, I think they should be very careful about who they allow in, because I think there is a legitimate concern about people who hold that they'll affirm the theological, like in seminaries, they'll affirm the theological confessions or the doctrinal statement, whatever it is. But at the same time, they're the sort of people who would be on the hiring committee who would bring someone in just to the left of them, and then to the left of them until it moves all the way, becomes like a sort of Princeton seminary situation. So I think there is legitimate concern to root out people who are kind of squishy, the squishes, and make sure people there's the old line that if any institution that is not explicitly right wing will eventually become left wing.
Right.
And that's, as a rule of thumb, I think that's true. And so you have to be willing to say no.
So here's a question then, because you mentioned Princeton, and I think Princeton's come up a few times in this conversation. Was it J. Gresham Machen who left Princeton and started Westminster? Was that Machen?
I believe so. Yeah.
You guys are historically minded.
Yeah.
Stephen, you're a good presby, don't you?
I should know that history, but I wasn't born and raised Presbyterian.
That's true.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's right. So I mean, Princeton Seminary became kind of liberalized.
Yeah.
And that's when the seminary in Philadelphia was started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so
and you
go ahead.
So I was going to say, you mentioned Machen. He just wrote a book about Christianity and liberalism. Mm-hmm. And one of the things he talks about in that book, I have it on my shelf here, but he mentions how there is something happening that's not straightforward with liberalism back then in the early 1900s, and I would say still today. And I mentioned it earlier. I called it word games. You can call it deception or whatever. And I don't think there's any one central governing agency making people do this, but
the NICE.
Yeah,
the National Institute of Coordinated Experiment.
That's right. It's coordinated.
But
the game is, though, to wear the skin, to basically infiltrate, conquer, slaughter, and wear the skin of an institution. So it looks Christian, it talks Christian, but it's not Christian.
That's grotesque.
Yeah, it uses the same words: faith, resurrection, life, salvation, God, Jesus. But speaking about what Machen was talking about, theological liberalism, his whole point in that book was this: it's not that they've gotten Christianity wrong; it's that this is an entirely different religion. Yeah. It's wearing the skin of Christianity, but it's not Christian. So I don't know if there's something inherent in the mechanism of liberalism that causes people to do that, but it is ubiquitous. It is pervasive everywhere. And
it's ancient too. I just read through Ezra and Nehemiah, and when the exiles returned from Babylon, they arrive in Jerusalem and they're greeted by the Samaritan people, Sumerian people. Essentially, these are hybridized people from many different nations, and they've been transplanted there in Judah, probably from a mixture of the Assyrian takeover and then the subsequent Babylonian takeover. But these people are there in the area of Jerusalem, and they approach the Jewish exiles who have now returned. Yes. And they say, "Oh, we're so glad you're here. We too worship your God."
Right.
And I love the response of Ezra. This is before Nehemiah enters the picture, and Ezra turned out to not be as strong of a leader as one would have hoped. But they go, "Get out of here! You are you're paying lip service to our God, but you're not really worshiping him. You guys are pagans. You're unrepentant pagans. You're steeped in this pagan ideology, and you're not going to have any part whatsoever in us rebuilding this temple." And you talk about a lack of tolerance and a lack of diversity. Ezra didn't go, "Well, I disagree with how you interpret our religion, but I'll defend to the death your right to say." He's like, "No, get out of here." And then you've got Nehemiah, who comes on later and is pulling out people's beards and smacking them in the face for intermarrying with these people. So my point is, this impulse of pagan religion and non-Christian sub-biblical ideas to masquerade itself as true religion, it's as old as the Old Testament.
Right. Yeah. Yea, hath God said. The very first thing was a dispute of words and what the meaning of words were. So, yeah.
Okay, that about wraps it up for this episode. The Think Podcast is a production of the Think Institute and is produced by yours truly, Joel Sedekase. The Think Institute operates under Church Movements, a ministry of Cru under the division of Cru City. To learn about how to support the Think Institute and my family, tax-free, go to thethink.institute/partner. I hope you heard something helpful today. I know I did. Remember, this is not goodbye. This has just been a short stop on the journey as we learn to lead our families in defending the Christian message. And we'll see you next time. Until then, I hope it made you think.